a letter arrived, silent as snowfall, unopened, unremarkable, and yet it carried the weight of a secret buried across the sea. What begins with a ciphered page soon unravels into a haunting pursuit through shadowed streets, forgotten crimes, and the kind of guilt that does not sleep. Some truths travel slower than lies, but strike much deeper when they finally arrive. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. It was upon a morning in early October of the year 1895 that I found myself once more in our familiar lodgings at 221B Baker Street, seated by the window with the Times folded upon my knee and a half-finished cup of tea cooling beside me. London, on such days, bears a curious quietude, as though the city itself holds its breath in anticipation of some whispered drama preparing to unfold. A pale light filtered through the fog-laced panes, muting the clamour of the street below to a dull hum. Sherlock Holmes, meanwhile, sat motionless in his armchair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze affixed not to any specific object, but rather to a point somewhere beyond the visible world. He had not spoken since breakfast, nor even stirred save for the rhythmic tapping of one slippered foot. There is, in my experience, a particular silence that attends the moments before a case announces itself. A hush, not of peace, but of imminence. I knew that look in Holmes's eyes too well. It was the expression of a mind already in motion, already perceiving a pattern not yet made known to me. Something, I felt certain, was coming. It was then that a light rap at the door announced the arrival of our morning post. Mrs. Hudson, with her usual briskness, entered and placed a single envelope upon the mantel, remarking that the remainder of the post was unremarkable, and swiftly retreating downstairs. Holmes did not shift from his pose, nor glance toward the envelope. I, however, leaned forward with idle curiosity. The envelope was of medium size, cream-coloured, with a foreign stamp affixed at an angle that suggested haste. No crest, insignia, or formal seal adorned its surface, only our address written in a slanting hand, bold and unfamiliar. From America, I believe, I ventured, noting the peculiar postmark smudged along the edge. Still Holmes made no move, yet I saw, with the subtle flicker of his eyelids and the minute tightening at the corners of his mouth, that he was already engaged, not with the paper, but with the puzzle it heralded. "I presume," said Holmes at length, his voice breaking the silence like a blade through still water, "that you notice the peculiar phrasing of the address, the inversion of London W, Baker Street 221B. That is the American custom. Moreover, the ink is faded at the corners, suggesting a journey of no small distance. Add to this the subtle compression in the handwriting, a practiced economy of space more often found in transatlantic correspondences than in our own." He rose, finally, and approached the envelope with the solemn air of a clergyman lifting a reliquary. It was written, I believe, in considerable agitation. Note the downward slant of the B, the pressure of the pen. See here, where the nib caught and tore the paper ever so slightly. That is the stroke of a hand in haste or fear. And the smudge on the lower left corner is no mere accident of handling. It is printer's ink, industrial grade, of a kind used in New York's lower docks. "You cannot possibly," I began, incredulous. "I can and do," he said with a faint smile. "This envelope bears a story not of affection nor formality, but of urgency, of a summons, Watson, drawn across the breadth of an ocean. And given its silence until now, I dare say its message shall be of the gravest kind. Open it." He stepped aside, hands behind his back, and turned toward the fire. I obeyed. The letter within was brief, no more than 4 paragraphs, but each word carried the weight of concealed desperation. It was signed by a Miss Clara Winthrop of New York City, whose name neither Holmes nor I recognized. Her plea, however, required no introduction. "My name may mean nothing to you," she had written, "but by the time you read this, the shadows that once fell over the East River will have found their way to London. A man has died, and another will follow, unless the truth is unearthed. I believe the secret lies with a letter, long buried and never delivered. My late husband warned me it would surface one day. That day, I fear, is now." She ended with a request, no, an appeal, that Mr. Sherlock Holmes lend his mind to a matter of life and death. The handwriting was uneven, slanting as if penned aboard a moving carriage, or beneath the press of fear. Holmes read it twice, then lowered the sheet gently to the table. "The East River, Watson," he murmured. "New York, and a letter lost to time." Outside, the morning fog had thickened. Inside, the air had taken on a new weight, one not of weather, but of mystery. Our bell rang just past noon, its metallic chime echoing with an urgency that belied the fog-choked quiet of Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson, ever discreet in her manner, ushered in a tall woman swathed in a travelling cloak of deep navy, her gloved hands clenched tightly about a worn reticule. She paused at the threshold, her eyes shifting from Holmes to myself and back again, as though uncertain which of us had summoned her, or which held the key to her deliverance. "I am Miss Clara Winthrop," she said, her accent unmistakably American, though softened by the effort of composure. "I wrote to Mr. Holmes last month. I feared I would be too late." "You are precisely on time," Holmes replied, gesturing toward the vacant chair beside the hearth. "Please, sit. Dr. Watson is a trusted colleague. You may speak freely." She lowered herself into the chair, yet her posture remained tense, her chin held high in defiance of the emotion that lingered just behind her eyes. I have seldom seen a countenance more divided, the outward poise of a woman of standing, betrayed by the tremor of her lip and the pallor beneath her powder. Holmes did not press her. He merely watched, fingers steepled, as one might observe the surface of a lake before a storm reveals what lies beneath. She took a steadying breath. "My husband is dead, Mr. Holmes, but I do not believe he died by natural means." We listened in silence as Miss Winthrop recounted the events that had brought her across the Atlantic in haste and solitude. Her husband, Julian Winthrop, had been a senior legal advisor at a reputable firm in New York, but had travelled to London on what she described as a private matter barely 4 weeks prior. He had taken rooms at the Hotel Langston in Bloomsbury, and according to the official report, was found lifeless in his bed one morning by a chambermaid, his features undisturbed, the cause declared to be cardiac failure. But he was not a man inclined to sudden illness, she insisted. He kept no vices, no cigars, no drink, and no affliction of the heart was ever spoken of. Her voice wavered, but did not falter. "He was frightened, Mr. Holmes. In the days before he left, he barely slept. He told me, 'Clara, if anything happens to me in London, it will not be chance.'" Holmes's brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. "Was he in correspondence with anyone here?" "I believe he was, though he did not confide in me the name." Holmes glanced toward the window, where the light had begun to fade. "Then I believe we must discover it for ourselves." What followed was a tale whose shadows reached further than we could have anticipated. Miss Winthrop leaned forward, lowering her voice as though the very walls of Baker Street might carry secrets if spoken too freely. "My husband had been pursuing the truth about a man named Elias Harrow. He disappeared in New York nearly 20 years ago, vanished without record, without even a whisper. At the time, Harrow was entangled in a civil case involving missing ledgers and blackmail allegations linked to a shipping company. Julian believed Harrow had penned a letter exposing the entire affair, and that the letter had been intended for someone here in London. She paused, glancing briefly at Holmes. But that letter never arrived. It was intercepted, buried, or destroyed. No one knows. Julian believed that if it resurfaced, certain powerful men, long thought untouchable, could fall. He thought they were watching him even then. "And what of Harrow?" I asked. She gave a slight shake of the head. "Presumed dead. No body was ever found, only silence." Holmes's fingers tapped the armrest with uncharacteristic unease. "A man who vanishes leaves behind not silence, Miss Winthrop, but an echo. Let us see where it leads." "There is more," she said, retrieving from her reticule a folded slip of parchment. "This arrived at my hotel 2 nights ago. No signature, no return address." She handed it to Holmes. The paper was coarse and yellowing, its message brief and printed in clipped typewritten font. "Leave England at once, Miss Winthrop. The truth will follow you into the grave." Holmes examined the corners, lifting the note to the light, his expression unreadable. "Typed on a Remington No. 2, he said quietly. "Common in American legal offices, though far from exclusive to them." I felt a chill, not from the autumn air, but from the knowledge that someone had eyes upon her. She had spoken of fear, but I had not truly seen it until now. Holmes folded the paper once more. "Then they know you are here, and what you seek." "And still," she said, her voice low but resolute, "I must know why my husband died." Holmes rose, paced once to the window, and stood in still contemplation, his silhouette framed against the grey afternoon. I could sense the shift in him, not of curiosity alone, but of calculation. There was weight in this matter, the kind that had little to do with simple crime and much to do with reputation, legacy, and the wounds of the past. He turned at last. "Miss Winthrop, there are cases where the guilty hide in shadows cast long ago, where the present is merely a reflection of concealed histories. I believe yours is such a case." Her hands tightened in her lap, but she said nothing. "You will remain in London. Do not change hotels, and do not attempt to make contact with anyone connected to your husband's firm. I ask only for your patience and your trust." "You have both," she said. Holmes nodded once and resumed his seat. "To bury a truth is one thing," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "But to bury a letter, that is a far more delicate operation." As the clock chimed 2, I opened my notebook. The game, it seemed, was once again afoot. We began our investigation at the Hotel Langston, a respectable establishment on the northern edge of Bloomsbury, where Mr. Julian Winthrop had spent his final days. Holmes, as ever, moved through the space with the quiet confidence of a man already assembling a pattern invisible to others. I, meanwhile, busied myself with questions to the manager and the chambermaid who had discovered the body. According to their accounts, Mr. Winthrop had kept irregular hours, often leaving the hotel after nightfall and returning before dawn. He had spoken to no guests, received no visitors, and requested his meals be left at the door. Yet despite this apparent seclusion, he had been overheard on more than one occasion speaking aloud in his room, his tone agitated, even pleading, though no other voice had ever answered. He looked hunted, the chambermaid told me, as if he feared even his own shadow. Holmes, meanwhile, had examined the bedchamber in silence. Now he crouched beside the writing desk, eyes narrowed. "Observe, Watson," he said, pointing to a slight smear on the wood. "Printer's ink, fresh, and here, on the underside of the blotter, a partial impression of a legal header, American in format. Whatever document he composed, or received, was no casual letter. Nothing in the hotel record suggested foul play. Yet Holmes's face, as we departed, was grim with certitude. "The manner of his death was calm," he murmured, "but the days that led to it were not. There is turbulence here still unaccounted for." That afternoon we made our way to the rented study Mr. Winthrop had maintained in a solicitor's office near Lincoln's Inn. The room was modest. Oak shelves, a desk of no distinction, a single brass reading lamp. Its neatness spoke of a man meticulous in habit, but Holmes, ever distrustful of outward appearances, swept the room with a keener eye. He paused before a shelf that held several volumes of New York State law reports and drew one forth, not the first or the last, but the seventh in the series. With a delicate touch, he turned its pages, then stopped abruptly. He tapped the spine. "This is not weight alone," he said. The book, as it turned out, had been carefully hollowed at its center, the inner pages removed and bound together with twine. Within the cavity lay a small black notebook, worn at the edges and wrapped in a faded scrap of parchment. Holmes untied the twine with practiced fingers. On the inside cover of the book, scrawled in a hand both sharp and hurried, were the initials E.H. "Elias Harrow," I murmured, leaning closer. Holmes gave a single nod. And now, at last, the first whisper from a man the world pronounced vanished. He turned the pages slowly, his eyes scanning lines of densely packed script, some of it in shorthand, others in full sentences, fragments of thought, lists of dates, and tucked within, something more substantial. "A cipher," Holmes said softly. "But not just any cipher. This is legal phrasing veiled in numbers." From within the final pages of the notebook, Holmes extracted a narrow slip of parchment, so brittle it threatened to disintegrate at our touch. It bore the ragged edge of a larger sheet, torn deliberately and folded with care. Upon it was written a partial address. Ink faded, the letters uneven, and beside it, a column of numbers arranged in no apparent sequence. "It is American parchment," Holmes observed, "from a legal brief, if I'm not mistaken. Likely torn from a case record, and this—" He pointed to the numerical script, a cipher keyed to something external, a ledger, perhaps, or a printed text. "It is incomplete, but its structure is too deliberate to be meaningless." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes set about his usual regimen of comparison and deduction. Several hours passed with no sound but the occasional murmur, the rustle of old ledgers, and the scrape of graphite on notepaper. "It is a form of legal substitution," he said at last, eyes bright with satisfaction. "Each number corresponds to a clause or phrase common to maritime contracts. This," he tapped a sequence, "is an address in London. Not just any address, Watson. A warehouse once owned by the Kingswell Shipping Company. It was struck from the records after a fire 10 years ago. Is it still standing? Only one way to find out." He closed the notebook with a definitive snap, eyes narrowing toward the window as the last light of day surrendered to evening. The past, it seemed, was beginning to answer. We had barely concluded our analysis of the cipher when Holmes retrieved from the depths of the hollowed law book a second item, an aged photograph, its corners curled and its surface faded with time. 3 men stood upon a wharf, their expressions indistinct, but their stances unmistakably deliberate. In the background, a vessel with a broken mast leaned against the pier, and behind it, a warehouse half shrouded in fog. Holmes examined it with an intensity that forbade interruption. After a few moments, he tapped the figure furthest to the right. "This man," he said, "is not unknown to me. You recognize him?" "Indeed. His name is Robert F. Lancer, an American smuggler with a reputation for maritime sleight of hand. Scotland Yard had interest in him briefly 5 years ago, when he was sighted in Limehouse under the alias Richard Loam. He vanished before they could question him." And you believe this photo to be from New York? The architecture suggests so, but the man's presence here in London, albeit under false identity, proves that whatever scheme was born across the Atlantic did not perish there. He turned the photograph over. On the reverse, in pencil, was scrawled Dock 42, East River, and below it, E.H. This, Holmes said, sliding the photograph into his notebook, was never meant as memory. It was a message. Tucked within the final pages of Harrow's notebook was a single torn scrap, barely legible, its ink smudged and its edges crumbling. Holmes handled it with great delicacy, spreading it flat across the desk beneath the lamplight. I leaned in to read it. Ledger buried in stone and silence. Only the guilty remember where. The sentence ended in a jagged tear, as though the remainder had been torn off in haste, or removed by one who feared what more it might reveal. A ledger, Holmes mused, and buried not metaphorically but literally, stone and silence, an archive perhaps, hidden in some place long forgotten. This was not an attempt to destroy the truth, but to lock it away. And the guilty remember where, I repeated, meaning others were involved. Holmes nodded slowly. Elias Harrow was not silenced for what he knew, but for what he recorded. Somewhere, a record remains, perhaps partial, perhaps complete, but damning enough that someone would kill to prevent its unearthing. He tapped the parchment once, firmly. Our next step, Watson, is to find someone who remembers the silence, someone who knows where stone still guards ink. We travelled by cab to a quiet alley off Fleet Street, where the great arteries of London journalism once pulsed with ceaseless ink and rumour. There, in a cellar beneath a shuttered press office, Holmes led me into the domain of one Mr. Silas Bellamy, a stooped, whispering archivist whose memory was as labyrinthine as the stacks he maintained. The room reeked of age, old paper, dried glue, and damp stone. Piles of unbound gazettes, court bulletins, and shipping manifests leaned against one another like half-forgotten empires. Mr. Bellamy, Holmes greeted, we seek a record not indexed, but never destroyed. Bellamy nodded without expression and gestured us into the dark. Names, he rasped. Elias Harrow, Robert F. Lancer, and the Kingswell Shipping Company. The archivist scuttled into the maze of shelving, and for the better part of an hour we heard only the creak of ladders and the rustle of pages. Then, from the gloom, he returned with a folded clipping and a bound maritime ledger wrapped in oilskin. The article was dated June 1876. It reported a fire aboard a vessel moored at the East River, owned by Kingswell. No casualties were listed, but among the witnesses named Elias Harrow. Curious, Holmes said, scanning it. A fire that burned the record but spared the truth, and yet no follow-up, no inquiry. Bellamy nodded once. The silence came later. Holmes accepted the ledger reverently. Then perhaps it is time we disturbed it. While Holmes delved further into the Kingswell ledger, I sought out a man whom he described as a mind once sharp enough to wound, and perhaps still keen enough to recall. Inspector Alderney Briggs had retired from Scotland Yard more than a decade ago, his service marked by a brief but fierce pursuit of a transatlantic blackmail ring that, Holmes suspected, overlapped with Harrow's disappearance. I found him in modest rooms near Clerkenwell Green, his voice thinned by age, but his mind by no means dulled. Over tea, I recounted the fragments Holmes and I had uncovered. Harrow, Briggs muttered, tapping his cane thoughtfully. A solicitor's clerk who got too close to someone else's fire. I remember him, nervous sort. Came to us once, whispered about death certificates being doctored to conceal the whereabouts of cargo. And the Kingswell Company? He gave a sharp nod. They were named, though not formally. Ships sailing light but declaring full holds. Ledgers vanished, men gone missing. It stank, Doctor, but the stench rose too close to Parliament for our superiors to stomach. The investigation was constrained. I asked whether Harrow might have attempted to preserve proof. He tried, Briggs said grimly. I believe he wrote it all down. Twice. One letter vanished. The other, well, if it exists, it was meant to find the right eyes. Or none at all. I left with a renewed sense of unease. If Harrow's ledger still lived, it did so surrounded by enemies. Some long dead, and some perhaps not yet finished with their work. Upon returning to Baker Street that evening, I found Clara Winthrop seated stiffly in the armchair beside the hearth, her eyes fixed upon the fire, though its warmth seemed not to reach her. Holmes had invited her to remain under our informal protection, citing the recent threats she had received. She had accepted without protest, but not, I sensed, without burden. She did not rise when I entered, nor did she speak until I was seated opposite her. "Do you believe in guilt passed down?" she asked without preamble. "I believe," I said gently, "that grief has many disguises, and some of them wear the face of guilt." She gave a hollow sort of smile. Julian never told me much, but he told me enough to know he feared something old, something he had once touched but no longer controlled. He said the past was not buried, it was simply better camouflaged. Was he complicit? I ventured. She did not answer directly. Instead, she turned toward the window, her voice quiet. He spent the last year searching archives, letters, men whose names he had sworn to forget. I believe he wanted to fix something, to be the man he thought he had once been. Holmes entered just then, bearing with him a parcel wrapped in cloth. "We have another trail," he said without greeting. "One that leads back to Dock 42 and a man who fled London under a false name." Clara stood. "Then you will find the truth?" Holmes met her gaze with calm intensity. "We may. But Miss Winthrop, truths, like letters, arrive in strange envelopes. Some enlighten, some destroy, and some regrettably do both." She nodded slowly and returned to her seat. Yet as the fire cracked in the grate, I could not help but wonder, was it fear that weighed upon her, or memory? Our carriage made its slow ascent through the withered countryside west of London, toward a once grand estate that now stood shrouded in mist and neglect. The Harrow property, though still bearing the weathered crest of its namesake upon the gate, had clearly been surrendered to time and disuse. The house itself loomed with the dispassion of memory long repressed. Ivy clung to crumbling walls, and every shutter hung uneven on its hinges. Holmes surveyed the building with a contemplative stillness, then advanced without hesitation. We were greeted at the door by Miss Edith Harrow, niece of the vanished Elias, whose expression betrayed no welcome. She was a lean, hard-featured woman, her voice clipped, her movements guarded. "I live here alone now," she said flatly. "The past is dead. It has nothing more to say." Holmes offered no argument, but asked to view the study. Edith hesitated, then relented. The room bore all the signs of disturbance: drawers yanked open, rugs displaced, even sections of panelling loosened. Yet dust had settled atop it all, indicating the search had occurred days prior. "Who else has been here?" Holmes asked. "No one with permission." Holmes moved to the hearth and lifted the lid of a scuttle. Inside, charred fragments of paper crumbled at his touch. "An attempt to destroy what they could not take," he murmured. "But not all flames are obedient." He pocketed one singed scrap, half a column of numerals inked in crimson, then turned to me. "Watson, we are no longer the only ones tracing Harrow's ghost." Upon our return to London that evening, we found Clara Winthrop visibly shaken. She had ventured only as far as a bookshop in Piccadilly, yet even in the daylight, she had felt eyes upon her. "I thought it mere nerves," she confessed, her fingers twisting at her gloves. "But near Albemarle Street, I glimpsed a man in a long coat. Twice. He kept to the opposite pavement, never speaking, never quickening his pace. But he followed me for 3 blocks, and then he was simply gone." Holmes did not chide her fear, nor offer hollow reassurances. Instead, he stood quite still, then said, "A message delivered without words may still speak volumes." He made immediate inquiries at the 2 nearest tobacconists and the club across from the bookshop. Though no name was given, a description emerged: tall, clean-shaven, and notably American in accent. "If our adversaries are now shadowing Miss Winthrop openly," Holmes said later, "then they are either emboldened or desperate." He gazed through the window into the mist-slicked street below. "And both, Watson, are signs that the clock is advancing faster than we knew." 2 mornings later, Holmes sent a message to me at the practice, requesting I meet him at the Colonnade Club, a discreet enclave frequented by foreign dignitaries and transatlantic merchants. I found him seated across from a well-groomed gentleman of perhaps 40, whose bearing suggested wealth, but whose eyes betrayed unease. "Dr. Watson, allow me to introduce Mr. Raymond Trent, recently of New York," Holmes said without preamble. The gentleman inclined his head politely but said nothing. "We were just discussing ships," Holmes continued with studied indifference, "and how they vanish." "I fear I know little of maritime affairs," Trent replied stiffly. "But surely you've heard the name Elias Harrow," Holmes pressed gently. At that, Mr. Trent's fingers curled tightly around his glass. A moment passed before he replied, "That name is unfamiliar." Holmes offered a thin smile. "Curious. For a man who once clerked beside Julian Winthrop, I would have expected better recall." Trent rose abruptly. "You have mistaken me for someone else, sir." Without another word, he departed. Outside, Holmes watched him disappear into the street. "Guilt," he murmured, "often chooses silence over denial. And when faced with truth, it does not argue. It flees." That evening, Holmes returned to the ciphered notebook recovered from Harrow's hidden volume. For hours, he toiled over the columns of numbers, cross-referencing them against shipping logs, financial ledgers, and American legal codes. I left him undisturbed, knowing that his mind required silence to perform its alchemy. By midnight, he looked up from the final sheet with the weary satisfaction of a man who has drawn blood from stone. "It is done," he said simply. "The cipher is a modified legal ledger code based upon contractual indexing. Each numeral refers to a clause, each clause to a specific transaction." He laid out a sequence before me, rows of figures neatly annotated. "These," he continued, "are payments, bribes, if one is honest, dispersed through shell companies tied to the Kingswell concern. And here, note the repeated reference to Parcel 32B. That parcel appears to have travelled aboard no fewer than 3 vessels, yet never appeared on any manifest." "What was it?" I asked. "A ledger," Holmes said. "The ledger Harrow wrote about. It was moved between ships like contraband, hidden from customs, and meant never to be found." He paused, fingers resting on a final page. "But this is the crux, Watson." I read the line he indicated. "Letter intercepted. Ledger hidden beneath altar stone. St. Brevins Limehouse." "A church?" I said in surprise. "A deconsecrated one. Sold to private hands in '84, but still standing." I could see now the gleam in his eye, cautious but alive with purpose. He leaned back. "Our missing letter, or what remains of it, may yet be waiting, beneath stone, in silence, just as Harrow foretold." It was the following evening when I first perceived it, that uncanny sensation, so easily dismissed, of being observed. Holmes was seated in his chair, poring over a stack of transatlantic legal filings, while I stood by the window, pipe in hand, the London fog smudging the lamps like ghosts made of smoke. Across the street, a man loitered beneath a lamppost, hat low, collar high. He was motionless too long for mere idleness. "Holmes," I murmured. "There's someone watching the building." He did not look up. "The man in the dark coat. You saw him?" "I saw his reflection in the bureau glass some 20 minutes ago." A beat passed. Then he added, "It is not Miss Winthrop alone who draws eyes now." I turned back toward the window. The figure was gone. Holmes rose and closed the blinds. "We are being measured, Watson. Not attacked, yet, but studied. Someone wishes to know how near we are to the truth. Should we be concerned?" "Always," he said, "but not frightened." There was a tap at the door then, Mrs. Hudson bringing in the evening post. Holmes rifled through the letters, then stopped at one, unmarked, sealed with red wax. He opened it in silence. Inside was a single line. "Leave the dead to their graves, Mr. Holmes. Some ghosts kill." Holmes folded it slowly. "And now," he said with grim calm, "they speak directly. The summons arrived just past 7 in the morning, as Holmes was preparing tea, and I had scarcely finished tying my cravat. It bore the unmistakable urgency of Inspector Lestrade's hand, and its brevity made my blood run cold. "One dead. St. James's Park. Unusual circumstances. Require your immediate attendance." Within half an hour, we stood beneath the greying canopy of late autumn elms. The air carried the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, muffling the murmurs of constables and early passers-by. The body lay on its back near the edge of a walking path, one arm outstretched as if reaching for some unseen hope. The wound was clean, deliberate, a narrow blade through the chest. Yet his pockets remained untouched, and a fine gold watch ticked still upon his chain. Robbery was not the motive. Holmes crouched beside the corpse, lifting the man's hand with gentle precision. "Note the grip," he said quietly. Whatever he held, he fought to retain it. A crumpled scrap was pried from the clenched fingers. Damp with dew, its ink smudged, but not illegible. It bore only 6 words, written in a trembling hand. "Tell her not to trust him." Holmes did not speak for some time. Then, rising with a deepening frown, he muttered, "This was not a message. It was a warning, too late to save its author, and perhaps not soon enough to save another." I asked who the victim was. Holmes answered with quiet certainty. "A man I confronted only days ago, and one, I fear, whose death is the hinge upon which this entire affair may turn." I followed Holmes as he stepped aside from the gathering crowd and removed his gloves, as though the act itself bore some ceremonial weight. He then turned to Lestrade. "The deceased is Raymond Trent, an American national. He arrived in London under that name, but he was once known to authorities as Richard Loam, a smuggler of moderate cunning and cowardly disposition." Lestrade whistled softly. "You knew him then?" "I confronted him," Holmes replied. "Days ago. He denied involvement, but trembled at the name Harrow. He was no killer, Lestrade. That is why he's dead." "What do you think he meant by the note?" Holmes's expression darkened. "It was meant for Clara Winthrop, I have no doubt. He must have learned something, perhaps too late, and sought to warn her. Someone ensured the warning would not arrive in time." He turned to me. "Watson, I misjudged the man. He was a coward, yes, but not without conscience." He drew in a breath, sharp and silent. And conscience, when paired with fear, can be a fatal mixture. Lestrade handed Holmes a small item wrapped in a handkerchief. "This was found in the inner breast pocket. Thought you'd want a look." Holmes unwrapped it with care. Inside was a torn fragment of the dockside photograph, the same image we had discovered in the hollowed law book. This portion displayed only the central figure and half of the one beside him, but there was no mistaking the background. The same leaning vessel, the same fog-draped pier. "Why would he carry this?" I asked. Holmes studied the edges. "Because he had the original. This is the missing corner torn from the one we found. He likely removed it after our encounter, fearing it would tie him too closely to the others." He lifted the scrap toward the light, and yet he kept it. Why? Guilt? Sentiment? Or perhaps it bore some clue we have yet to see. His eyes narrowed. "Notice the ink here, along the torn edge. There was writing on the back, and it continued onto the portion we already hold. Then the message was incomplete." "Deliberately so," Holmes said. "A trail divided, to be pieced together only by those who knew where to look, and, perhaps, whom to trust." The very hour we returned from the park, Holmes instructed a cab to be readied without delay. "We must see to Miss Winthrop," he said. "The pattern now moves too swiftly, and I would rather be premature than a minute too late." We arrived at her lodgings near 10:30. The door to her flat was ajar. "Stand behind me," Holmes said softly. We entered with caution. The drawing room was empty, but a faint sound, like a dropped object, echoed from the hallway. Holmes moved ahead swiftly, and I followed with dread coiling in my chest. Clara lay on the floor of her study, her head resting against the leg of an overturned chair. Her face was pale, her pulse shallow, but steady. "She's been struck," I whispered. "No," Holmes said, examining her temple. "No visible wound. Fainted, most likely. Shock or fright." At the foot of the door lay a sealed envelope, slipped beneath the threshold. Holmes picked it up without opening it and turned it over. There was no name, only a single phrase written in a slanted hand across the front. "Your sins cannot be buried." Clara stirred then, her voice hoarse. "He was..." "Here." Holmes's jaw tightened. "And he left his answer." Holmes opened the envelope with delicate precision. Inside was a single folded sheet, thick, cream-coloured, with the texture of aged correspondence. At first glance, it seemed authentic. The ink faded, the paper yellowed, and the seal, though broken, bore the impression of a signet we had seen referenced in Harrow's notebook. He read the contents aloud, though his voice betrayed little emotion. It was, ostensibly, a letter from Elias Harrow confessing to a conspiracy involving multiple parties, including Julian Winthrop. It named no specific victims, but implied that Harrow had willingly disappeared to escape retribution. The tone was one of weary contrition. Holmes said nothing for several moments. Then he rose and lit a taper from the hearth. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Preserving the integrity of the case," he replied coldly. He held the flame to the bottom corner of the page, watching as the paper curled and darkened. "It is a forgery," he said. "Beautifully executed, but false. The phrasing is wrong, too modern in cadence, and the ink, when warmed, reveals chemical inconsistencies." He turned to Clara. "Someone wants you to believe your husband was a villain, or at least a man complicit in villainy. But this was not written by Harrow. It was composed by one who fears what the real letter might reveal." Clara looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. "Then, they are not finished?" "No," Holmes replied softly, "but neither are we." The hour was late and the fire low, yet Holmes remained as rigid and alert in his armchair as if he had only just risen for the day. I, seated opposite him with my journal unopened in my lap, watched the slow dance of embers upon the grate, and knew that a revelation as inevitable as dawn hovered unspoken between us. Holmes broke the silence with a sigh so faint it might have passed unnoticed. "Watson," said he, "do you recall the ink-stained edge upon the photograph?" "Of course," I replied. "The severed message, which now connects the dead man in the park to Elias Harrow's affair. Indeed, but it was not the message alone. It was the decision to carry it, despite its danger, which speaks volumes. He leaned forward, his fingers steepled. It is not the dead who frighten our adversary. It is the letter Harrow never sent, the one no one has seen. I blinked. You believe there were two? I am certain. The forgery was too convenient, the timing too precise. No, someone feared what else Harrow might have written, and that fear narrows our suspect list considerably. I sat up. Then who, Holmes? He gazed into the ashes. A name repeated thrice but spoken never. Edwin Cole, partner to Julian Winthrop, clerk in New York during the Harrow disappearance. A man whose ambition has always outpaced his conscience. In his methodical fashion, Holmes summoned from the depths of his scrapbook a clipping from the New York Herald, dated some 20 years prior. It bore a report concerning a contested will, in which the name Edwin Cole appeared as a young legal clerk present during the mysterious absence of one Elias Harrow. He was never charged, Holmes said, but his name appears frequently alongside Julian Winthrop's during that period. Cole left New York abruptly soon after the Harrow case was buried and, rather conveniently, resurfaced in London, where he attached himself to Winthrop's rising star. Do you believe he aided in the cover-up? I believe he authored it, Holmes replied. The payments recorded in Harrow's ciphered notes, those that shifted through shell accounts, terminate in London, and two of those companies are listed under Cole's silent directorship. It is a pattern painted in shadow, but discernible nonetheless. He tapped the newspaper with a slender finger. Cole is a man who has spent his life mastering discretion. He would not kill lightly. But the moment Winthrop showed signs of repentance, the moment he contemplated revealing the truth, Cole's hand was forced. He paused. The time has come, Watson, to force it again. That very morning, Holmes dictated a carefully worded letter to a well-connected solicitor in Lincoln's Inn, Mr. Peregrine Blake, whose discretion was equalled only by his appetite for rumour. The message was plain enough. Clara Winthrop, with her late husband's papers now reviewed, intended to publish the Harrow letter and all connected documentation by week's end. This will reach the intended ears within hours, Holmes declared. And if Mr. Cole is indeed the spider at the centre of this web, he will act before the ink dries. And if he does not, I queried. Then I shall have impugned an innocent man, he replied dryly. But I rather doubt that possibility. By dusk, we had installed ourselves within Blake's private chambers, the supposed original Harrow letter placed visibly upon the solicitor's desk. The fire was banked low, the windows shuttered, and all light extinguished, save a single shaded lamp. Inspector Lestrade, summoned without detail, crouched silently in the far corner, his revolver hidden beneath his coat. Holmes, eyes closed, hands laced over his chest, did not speak for a full hour. Then softly, "Fear is the great unraveller, Watson. Even the careful man, when cornered by guilt, may mistake silence for safety." It was 11:30 when we first heard it. The faint click of a lock's manipulation, followed by the gentle whisper of the outer door inching open. A draught moved through the room, and even Lestrade's breath stilled. Holmes did not move. He had instructed us earlier to let the intruder reach the desk without challenge. Guilt must be allowed to believe it is still hidden, he had said. Only then does it reveal its face. Soft footfalls passed down the corridor. A silhouette appeared in the doorway, stooped but deliberate, and paused before entering. By the narrow beam of lamplight, I saw the glint of steel, an envelope knife clutched in a gloved hand. He stepped to the desk. The moment his fingers closed upon the envelope, Holmes sprang from the darkness. "Mr. Cole," he said with quiet finality. The intruder froze, his face half illuminated, eyes wild behind spectacles. You lied," he breathed. Holmes stepped forward, Lestrade rising behind him. Yes, as you did, but yours ended in blood. Mine ends in justice. Cole backed away, but Lestrade blocked the door. You cannot know what they made me do, he said, voice breaking. You cannot know what it cost. Then tell us, Holmes replied, and let the law bear the burden next. The moments that followed were without violence, yet not without agony. Cole, his shoulders sagging, sank into the nearest chair, as if his spine had dissolved. The knife clattered to the floor, forgotten. I did not kill Harrow, he began, voice hoarse. But I helped them bury him. I forged documents, paid men, lied to widows, because I was young, and I believed survival was virtue. His hands trembled. But Julian, he kept the second letter. He said it would ruin them all if ever he lost his nerve. I begged him to burn it. And when he refused, Holmes asked, low and precise. I watched, Cole said, eyes glistening. And I waited. When the silence ended, when he told me he meant to come forward, I struck. He wept then, silent and bitter, the tears of a man long past redemption. Holmes nodded to Lestrade, who moved to secure the man. But before he left, Cole turned to Clara, who stood behind us in the doorway. I am sorry, he said. He died trying to protect you from all of us. Clara said nothing. As Cole was led away, Holmes turned to me. There is justice, he said softly, but sometimes it wears the face of ruin. In all my years beside Holmes, I had witnessed the unravelling of many men, some with the bravado of scoundrels, others with the brittle pride of those too long shielded by power. Yet I had seldom seen a reckoning unfold with such quiet devastation as that which occurred between Clara Winthrop and Edwin Cole. The solicitor's chambers were still cloaked in half-light. Cole, now seated and disarmed of all pretense, looked up as Clara entered the room. She said nothing at first. Her gaze, steady, sorrowful, met his with the weight of every sleepless hour she had borne. You knew him, she said finally, her voice raw with tremor. You stood beside my husband, broke bread with him, took his trust, and you killed him. Cole flinched, but did not speak. Why? She asked. Was it money, fear, or was it simply easier to erase a man than face the truth he might tell? Cole's lips parted, but again no words came. Holmes stood to one side, silent. His eyes narrowed not in judgment, but in observation. He knew that no deduction, however brilliant, could equal the clarity of conscience summoned by grief unmasked. I trusted you, Clara whispered. He trusted you, and you made a coward's ruin of it all. She stepped back then, not with fury, but with a desolate dignity that chilled the room. I do not want your apology, she added, her voice breaking. I want my husband, and you cannot give him back. The walls, once guarded by silence and strategy, collapsed then within Edwin Cole, like so much rotted timber. His face, aged by a single hour, drooped beneath the burden of confession not yet spoken but already owned. It was never supposed to come to this, he murmured. I wanted to stop him, not end him. He looked to Holmes, then to the floor. It began in New York. My client, our client, was a man of power and pride, and Harrow had found something he should not have. He spoke then of ledgers, altered identities, and a cargo manifest that bore not goods, but names of those bought and sold, erased or ruined. Harrow, once an idealist, had grown disillusioned. He threatened to expose it all. Julian tried to shield him. His voice cracked. I helped cover the tracks. I thought it would pass. He turned to Clara. Your husband kept a second letter. He never told me its contents, only that it named names and bore the truth I helped bury. He closed his eyes. When I learned he meant to send it, when I saw he would not be silent, I panicked. Watson's voice faltered here in his account, for no narrator can speak with comfort of a man's undoing. But I must write it as it was. There, in the dim chamber where falsehoods had flourished, Edwin Cole wept, not for forgiveness, but for the futility of a life spent fleeing a truth that never stopped pursuing him. Lestrade had waited, as instructed, until all words had run their course. Now, without ceremony, he stepped forward and produced the warrant Holmes had ensured was signed in advance. "Edwin Cole," he said, his voice firm but not unkind, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and the unlawful concealment of evidence." Cole did not resist. He merely nodded, as if some hidden clock within him had at last wound down. Holmes, ever measured, folded the forged Harrow letter once more and placed it within his coat. "The truth, Mr. Cole, may be heavier than lies," he said, "but it does not decay." As the door closed behind them and the shadows resumed their rightful place among the corners, I glanced at Clara. She had not moved. Only her hands, clasped tightly at her waist, betrayed the battle still raging within. We escorted Clara home that night in silence, the streets hushed and silvered by mist. Holmes did not speak, nor did she, and I, seated across from her in the cab, found myself unable to meet her eyes. When we arrived, she paused at the foot of her stair and turned to Holmes. "Will there be more?" she asked. "Perhaps," he answered, "but the worst has passed." She inclined her head, but said no more. As she climbed the steps alone, I was struck not by her fragility, but by the grace with which she bore her sorrow, like a widow carved in marble, ageless and unyielding. Later, as Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, I remarked, "You gave her justice." He shook his head. "I gave her the truth. Whether it feels like justice is another matter." In the days that followed, I saw Clara only once more, walking along the Thames, alone, her veil lifting slightly in the wind. I did not call out to her. There are griefs, I have come to believe, which are not lessened by words. Only time, and the knowledge that one's loss held meaning, may lend them shape. But they do not vanish, they settle. The warmth of our sitting room on Baker Street that evening stood in peculiar contrast to the chill that lingered within me. Outside, the rain traced silver veins down the panes, and the fire burned low, casting a soft glow across Holmes's angular features as he sat once more in his accustomed chair. There was no elation in his posture, no smug satisfaction in the unravelling of a mystery well deduced. He sat in quiet contemplation, the fingers of one hand steepled before him, the other resting lightly upon the arm of his chair. I poured 2 cups of tea and passed one to him without comment. For a long while, we did not speak. It was Holmes who broke the silence at last. "Watson," he said without raising his gaze, "truth is seldom a comfort, but it is, at the very least, an anchor." I nodded, though I confess I did not wholly grasp his meaning then. There was a solemnity about him, as though even the brilliant conclusion of our inquiry had extracted a cost not so easily accounted for. And so, as the flames crackled softly, I awaited the final weaving together of all we had seen. Holmes leaned forward, placing his fingertips together in that familiar gesture which so often signalled the emergence of structure from chaos. "Let us begin at the beginning," he said. The envelope which arrived that morning, plain, unremarkable, save for the faint tobacco scent native to American mail depots. The hand was that of a woman attempting steadiness, which suggested emotional strain. From there, each thread has revealed itself. He gestured to the collection of items now laid upon the table. The photograph, the ciphered notebook, the legal brief, and the forged Harrow letter. Each one, a separate stroke in a darkening portrait. Clara's husband, he continued, was drawn back into a conspiracy long thought dormant. Elias Harrow's disappearance, so many years ago, had never truly faded from view. What buried it was not time, but money, fear, and the machinery of privilege. The notebook, Holmes tapped it lightly, concealed in a hollowed law tome, bore the initials E.H., and it was no mere diary. It was a ledger of hush payments and encoded shipping routes tied to falsified manifests. The photograph, 3 men on a dock. One was known to me from Limehouse, a smuggler with American affiliations. The second was Harrow. The third was Edwin Cole's client. I listened, scribbling fragments into my journal as Holmes continued. The forged letter, he said, lifting it delicately, was Edwin's attempt at misdirection. But forgery bears fingerprints, metaphorically, if not literally, and its inconsistencies betrayed him. He exhaled, the briefest smile curling at the edge of his mouth. Truth, when pieced together with patience, has a way of resisting burial. And Julian Winthrop? I asked gently. Holmes's expression softened. He was not innocent, he said. Years ago he served as a junior clerk during the height of the Harrow affair. He processed papers, notarized lies, turned his eyes when silence was requested. But men change. He paused, gazing into the fire. When Harrow's name resurfaced, perhaps in some idle recollection or buried guilt, Winthrop began to trace the edges of the truth. I believe he found the second letter, or part of it, and realized that silence had long since become complicity. He sought to redeem himself, Holmes said. He wrote to me, he gathered evidence, quietly, cautiously, but Edwin Cole sensed the shift, and fear, as it so often does, prompted murder. I swallowed the weight of that truth. Then he died trying to do right? Holmes inclined his head. He died trying to undo what he had helped preserve. That distinction, while subtle, is not insignificant. It struck me then how quiet redemption can be, not declared in great acts, but written in margins, carried in silence and sealed in a man's final choices. And what of the original Harrow letter? I asked after a moment. The true one, not the forgery? Holmes raised his eyes, their grey depth unreadable. Lost, he replied. Perhaps burned, perhaps never sent, perhaps still resting in some hollow floorboard of a boarding house now demolished. He stood and walked slowly to the window. There are truths, Watson, that the dead choose not to pass on. Harrow was silenced. Winthrop tried to speak, but the letter itself, the pure record of what occurred, may have perished before it could serve justice. I joined him at the window. The rain had not ceased, nor had the world grown brighter. But we know, I said quietly. Holmes nodded. We know enough. He turned back, striking a match and lighting his pipe. The room filled slowly with smoke, thick, fragrant, and curiously solemn. Sometimes, Holmes murmured, the greatest mercy we can offer the past is to carry its truth without demanding its proof. We stood together in silence then, not in triumph, but in the sobering company of justice belatedly served. Outside, London breathed on. Inside, Baker Street returned to stillness. The rain had settled into a steady, unobtrusive rhythm by the time the clock struck 9. Outside, the street was slick with reflections, gaslight shimmering on wet cobblestones, and the occasional clatter of a passing cab muffled by distance and drizzle. Within the familiar walls of our sitting room, there was a profound stillness, one I had come to associate not with peace, but with aftermath. Holmes reclined in his chair, not asleep, but still. His gaze had turned inward, lost in those deeper channels of thought that no companion could quite follow. The fire had burned down to quiet embers, casting long shadows that flickered with a gentle breath against the ceiling. Neither of us had spoken for some time. There was nothing to be added, no conclusion to append. The facts had been laid bare, the guilty exposed, and justice, such as it may be called, administered. And yet I felt no satisfaction, only a subdued ache, as though the echoes of Clara Winthrop's sorrow still reverberated faintly through the floorboards of Baker Street. It is a curious thing, how some truths do not settle cleanly upon the heart, even when they are clearly seen. Holmes did not look at me. He merely said, "The storm has passed, but the air is heavier for it." "It is a remarkable thing," Holmes murmured after a long pause, "how guilt compresses the distances between men." I turned to him, uncertain of his meaning. "A letter may travel across oceans, Watson, but a guilty conscience, that requires no postage, no carriage. It finds its destination unerringly and always arrives ahead of the truth." I watched the delicate curl of smoke rise from his pipe, mingling with the dim light. He did not speak with venom, nor with pity, but with the sober cadence of a man who had seen too many confessions arrive too late to matter. Elias Harrow vanished, and with him a truth buried for decades. But that truth found its way into Clara's life, into Julian Winthrop's final days, and into Edwin Cole's sleepless nights. Harrow did not rise from the grave to speak, yet the consequences of his silencing have never ceased to whisper. I found myself nodding, and still, not all of it came to light. Holmes gave a faint shrug. "Some truths do not survive the journey. Others are discarded by those too frightened to carry them. And a few," he added, glancing toward the hearth, "are spoken only when there is no one left to hear." We sat a while longer in that silence, which was no longer comfortable, but necessary. For in that hush, there was room for reckoning, not of crimes, but of conscience. Outside, the rain showed no signs of stopping. It was I who noticed the envelope first. A telegram, slipped beneath the door and now resting upon the hearthrug like a summons from the world beyond our quiet chamber. I rose, retrieved it, and broke the seal. As my eyes scanned the lines, I felt the now familiar pull of duty stir within me. "It's from Scotland Yard," I said aloud. "Inspector Lestrade requests your presence regarding a break-in at the British Museum. 2 guards injured, no signs of theft. Curious, isn't it?" Holmes did not stir. "There will always be another case, Watson," he said, his voice steady, "but not always the time to reckon with the one just concluded." I nodded slowly, folding the telegram and placing it on the table. We would answer it, no doubt. We always did. But for the moment, it seemed the room had not yet finished speaking of the dead. Holmes relit his pipe, the flame briefly illuminating the hollows of his face before settling back into the shadows. "There is no greater burden," he said quietly, "than a truth spoken too late." The words hung in the air, not as judgment, but as a eulogy, for Julian Winthrop, for Elias Harrow, and perhaps for all those whose courage arrived a day too slow. The coals whispered their final crackle. The rain continued to fall. And in that dim, smoke-laced quietude of Baker Street, we sat, 2 men, and the unspoken cost of knowing. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin, as the final ember in our hearth gave a soft sigh of light. "There are crimes, Watson," he said quietly, "that are committed not out of malice, but from the desperate wish to preserve what should have never been hidden in the first place. Secrets, when buried long enough, do not decay, they ferment, and when they resurface, it is rarely in silence." I glanced at the copy of the forged letter still resting on the table, its words clever but soulless. "And Clara?" I asked. "Do you believe she'll find peace now?" Holmes's eyes did not lift. "Peace? Perhaps, but not the kind that forgets. She has inherited truth, Watson, and truth, when it arrives too late, has the cruel habit of feeling like punishment. What do you think? Was the true turning point when Edwin Cole committed murder, or when he first chose to hide the letter? If this mystery left you pondering justice, guilt, and the weight of untold truths, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more tales from Baker Street, don't forget to subscribe and pass this story along to a fellow mystery lover.